Welcome to The People's View, a program dedicated to discussing local, state, and national issues and their effect on the American people. The People's View provides a platform for state representatives and national figures to present their viewpoint. Whether it's social, economic, or financial topics, you'll hear it on The People's View.
Welcome to The People's View. This is a program sponsored by the Nashua Republican City Committee, and you can contact them at their website at nashuagop.org. Co-hosts are Representative Peter Silva from Ward 5, 8, and 9 in Nashua, and Representative Carl Seidel in Ward 1. We always welcome your comments. And today our guest is the Secretary of State, William Gardner. Welcome aboard, Bill. Nice to see you here in the Legislative Office Building. And we're going to ask Bill to tell us a little bit about what the duties of the Secretary of State and how long he's been doing it.
So, well, you're starting this pretty early in the morning before a legislative session. And the Office of Secretary of State goes back to 1680. And and under the New Hampshire Constitution, it has always been selected. The person who holds the position has been selected by the General Court. And it was a one-year term until 1877, and it's been a two-year term since then, like terms for governor and state reps like yourself, and state senators and governor's councils. The office has varied duties. There are 16 separate articles in the Constitution that make reference to the Secretary of State with certain duties and obligations. And that is, there's no other position except for the governor and then the House and the Senate that has that kind of constitutional responsibility. The office has always been responsible for elections. The Secretary of State is the Chief Elections Officer. That's the work that most people sort of, when they think of the Secretary of State, they think of elections, they think of their ballots when they get their ballots that have the federal, state, and county offices on the ballot. Those ballots are all printed by the state, by the Secretary of State's office, distributed to all the cities and towns. Also, the Secretary of State is responsible for the governor and council meetings, for the agendas, for the minutes of those meetings. We have to keep an official record every couple of weeks when the governor and council meet. The governor and council used to meet in private until the 1930s. And it's an interesting story how a governor at the time in the 30s there was a new reporter who the governor knew, and the person came in and sat there and was amazed at what went on, and the next day it was in the newspaper, and from that day on those meetings have been covered, and but they weren't before that. Also, the Secretary of State has the Corporation Division. It's the division that registers all in-state, domestic, for-profit, non-profit, LLCs, trade names, and foreign corporations that are from other states that come in. All of that used to be done by the legislature until about the turn of the previous century, a little over 100 years ago. The legislature, you couldn't be a corporation unless someone put a bill in that the House and Senate would approve of and allow that entity to be a corporation. The legislature decided at one point back a little over a century ago that it would be done as part of the Secretary of State's office. All the records, the Constitution says that the records of the state shall be kept in the office of the Secretary of State. So all of the state documents and all of the town records prior to the Revolution are included out at the state archives. and all of the most precious documents that we have, and one of the most precious, if not the most, is a document that created this country, that made us a nation. In New Hampshire, being the 9th state, when the Constitutional Convention in 1787 decided that they approved of a document that would be the Constitution, provided that 9 states would actually vote to ratify it. And New Hampshire happened to be the 9th, not because it was planned that way, but it happened. And so on June 21st, 1788, we became the United States of America, and we did because of what happened about a half a mile from where we are right now here in Concord, a vote to ratify that document. And a copy was sent with our approval, and included in that document were 12 amendments that New Hampshire delegates thought ought to be added to the Constitution. And the first one, number one, was that anything that was not in the U.S. Constitution would be left to the states. So for New Hampshire, what became the 10th Amendment was the first Amendment for New Hampshire. And that document is up at the State Archives and protected, and evolved in a way that it'll be preserved.
Yeah.
It'll be preserved. And I know you have an issue that right now about how often that should be made public, and it's but a lot of the Declaration of Independence, the state's copy. We have a lot of correspondence between the province of New Hampshire and King George. As a matter of fact, the reason why New Hampshire has the big legislature that we have, the most representative in the country of any of the states, and the 3rd biggest in the world, the English-speaking world, is because there was a struggle during the provincial period. The people who lived here during those years, up until 1776, the only person that they could actually vote for themselves was their representative. The governor was appointed by the king. A lot of officials were appointed by the royal governor, who was appointed by the king, and the king had some other appointments as well. But the people had one office that they could choose, and that was the office. And so they were very protective of that office, and they wanted that office to be one that had as much authority as possible, because it was the only one that they actually had a say in. Well, the royal governor used to like to grant towns, because the more towns that he could grant, the more land he could make available to his friends and supporters. And when you walk in Representatives Hall from the back side, you'll see that big portrait of Benning Wentworth. It's about 10 feet tall. Well, Benning Wentworth was the governor that crossed the Connecticut River. He had no right to do that, because everything to the west of the Connecticut River was part of the province of New York. The only reason there's a Vermont today is because of New Hampshire and because of Benning Wentworth, because he he granted these towns to people in the province of New York. He had no authority to do that. But as he continued granting more of them, eventually they didn't want to be part of New York, and they became an independent place for a little while, and then they became Vermont. But when he granted the town, he had the right to put restrictions, and he said, sometimes he would say, for the next 10 years you have to get to Portsmouth 25 or 50 white pines that are at least 2.5 feet wide for the shipbuilding. And if they didn't do it, he could just say, okay, for the next 3 years you have no member of the assembly. Some people called it the assembly then, some people the legislature. But he could deny representation. And that was really a big bone of contention between the people and the royal governor. And 12 years before the Declaration of Independence, he said, okay, I will give up that authority. There was sort of a grand deal that they made, the members of the assembly and the royal governor. And so a resolution was passed that said that he would no longer have that authority. But everything that they did had to go to the king. And the king was King George III, who was the king during the Revolution. But this was 12 years before. And so 3 years later, after the king received it, it was vetoed. And that document is at the state archives. The veto of, then the king said, I'm not going to let my royal governor give up that authority. So I'm going to veto this. And the council, and the reason we have a governor's council, because the king had a council. And if you look at the list on this document, you'll see the Earl of Grafton, the Duke of Rockingham, our county names are, and so that document, that became so significant that all of the colonies had reasons why they fought the revolution. But one of New Hampshire's big reasons was representation, was allowing people to have more of a say in their government. And so when the first Constitution was written in 1776, and New Hampshire was the first of the 13 colonies to declare separation from the king. New Hampshire did it 6 months before the Declaration of Independence. And the only difference between what New Hampshire wrote in January, the first week of January of 1776, the document set up a new free and independent form of government. It said, we are separating from the king because we have been denied our rights and privileges as Englishmen. And the only difference between what Thomas Jefferson, although his language was a little more memorable because it was written in sort of a more memorable way, but New Hampshire said, we're declaring our separation, we're establishing a new independent form of government, and but if you restore those rights and privileges to us someday, we will consider coming back. That's the only difference. That's the only difference. Jefferson said, we'll all die. You're going to have to kill us all because we're never coming. So New Hampshire declared first its independence. And in that document, it set up that any township that had 100 eligible voters would have representation. And that was January 1776. Then in 1783, after the end of the Revolution, they amended that document and put it out to the people for a vote. They couldn't do it in 1776 because they had already had the event at Fort William and Mary when they captured all the powder here. It was sort of in wartime, and so the elected officials wrote that and said, we are no longer the province of New Hampshire, we have separated. Well, the Constitution that was actually adopted by the people in 1783 increased it from 100 to 150 eligible voters. And that remained until the 1870s, almost 100 years. In the 1870s, they changed the 150 to 600. But they included women and children. Before that, you had to be 21 and a male. So by increasing it to 600, but including women and children, and knowing that the average lifespan in those years were in the high 50s, the 600 was almost equal to the 150. And so New Hampshire had that 600 right up into World War II. But it was a right bestowed to the towns. The legislature didn't have to do the type of redistricting. That all changed in the 1960s with the decision, the one man, one vote decision. So the idea in New Hampshire was that the more people who could share the power of government, the better. The more voices that were part of it, the better. And so the whole structure that they created at the beginning was to have the checks and balances. Not only the legislative branch where you have the House and the Senate, you sort of a check on each other, but in the executive branch, unlike any other state, we have basically two governors. We have one who's elected by all the people, and then we have 5 that have 1/5, but they can stop appointments, they can stop any contract, so the governor has to get 3. So 3 of them, and they have the authority to actually make nominations if they want. Naturally, a governor would say, well, I'm not going to let you do that, I'm going to veto everything, but the councils could actually say, well, we're going to veto everything you do. And there have been times in my years, during the last several decades, where they've actually reached that kind of situation. It hasn't happened in recent times, but so we have a check and balance in the executive branch as well as the legislative branch.
We're the only state that does that.
We're the only state where the council, originally Massachusetts had something like that, and so did Maine, but both of those states, Maine does not have it. Massachusetts has remnants of it, but they don't have anywhere near the same kind of authority that we have, and it goes back to the king. The king had a council, and that veto message that the king sent back in the late 1760s had the council. So, you know, when people came here, it's sort of like if we were to colonize a planet, how would we set up a government? We would set it up pretty much like what we had, or some semblance of it. They might want some reform, but what happened, the people who came here, they brought their cultural baggage. They brought their culture with them. They brought their baggage, clothes, or whatever they had, but they also brought what their culture was. And so there was the people that came from the regions that they did in England that came to New Hampshire followed where did we get the word sheriff? Where did we get a lot of the positions? It came from what they were familiar with.
The council, they could veto anything the governor puts in?
Any nomination, it takes 3 votes on the council.
What about a bill?
Any contracts that go before, any item that goes before the governing council, 3 of the councilors can prevent it.
They don't handle any of the legislative bills. It's just the activities that...
No, the vetoes are not included.
Yeah.
A veto is separate. The governor does not have to have the council accept the veto. That's the one thing that the governor is given without consent of the council. But just...
Mrs. Secretary,
Yeah.
I think we could read history all day long.
Makes me feel
Unfortunately, we have only a few more minutes to talk about some of the other items we wanted to get to. Your voter ID, the redistricting, and some of the interesting statistics that you have brought with you about what's changed since the primary as far as voter registration and everything. So maybe we could start with one of those, the voter ID bill. You're working with Senator
Bradley, Senator Prescott,
right.
Senator Carson.
So can you outline the concept that your approach takes?
What they've been doing is working with the city and town clerks to sort of make sure that there's a process that they feel they've had that's workable for them, and accomplish what a lot of legislators want to accomplish. So at this point, first of all, we don't know how many people this will involve. Some people feel that it's 1% or less of the population, and others feel it's as much as 10 or 11%. And I don't like to use national statistics for New Hampshire because we've always gone our own way, and we don't really know. We don't know until we actually do it. And in the legislation that was first presented, there was going to be an election. It was actually going to be the presidential primary, where everybody was going to be asked, so that we would have some idea. Because once you have an idea, then you know in a presidential election like this coming November, we'll have somewhere between 700 and 800,000 people participating. We had 750 in 2008. And if it's 10 or 11%, we're talking about 80,000 people. And if it's 1% or less, we're talking about 7 or 8,000. And it could be in between, but it could be at one end or the other end. And so how do you do it? And the sticking point that the legislature had reached a year ago was last year, was the provisional ballots, where we're going to keep the election process going for 3 days rather than 1 day. And the sitting town clerks had a lot of issues with that. There were a lot of unintended consequences that whenever you change, and believe me, I've been through this, I've made as many mistakes as other people. You think you do a certain thing and you think this is the way it's going to turn out, and sometimes it doesn't, and it just doesn't, and we're all humbled by that because that's life. And so this legislation is an attempt to have photo ID, but not to have the election day extended 2 and 3 days afterwards. And so what they're looking at is that if somebody comes in to vote, if they don't have one of the required picture IDs, that they would be identified, and they would, and the clerks have come up with different examples of how they think would be the best way to do that, whether it would be to put the person's name and take a picture with the name and the person, and then that would be, but the person would be able to vote. So you have to think, would that help to prevent? And I think, knowing what we know from the presidential primary, with what happened in some of the polling places, that if you ask a person to identify himself or herself, and you actually have a record of it, it's going to be a deterrent. And you're never going to be able to fix everything. You're never going to be able, but I support photo ID. I think that we might end up having fewer people that actually don't have it than we think, and we will know that once we do it the first time.
And there'll be an easy way for people to get a photo ID if they don't have anything.
Right, and there was, in the legislation last time, had ways that
Right.
that could, but what I had said at the beginning was sort of a goal of mine was that if somebody shows up at the polling place, let's have photo ID, but let's have a system that doesn't send anyone home without voting. So how can we combine the two so that the public feel that their votes
Mean something.
mean something, are worth something, are not being taken away from them? How do we, and yet those that come in, how do we sort of balance that? And that's what they're working on, and a lot of people are working on now, and I think there will be some before the end of this session.
You know, are we the only state in that too, Rena, that doesn't require some type of ID to vote? You know,
No.
There are others.
Yes. At this point, there's no other New England state. Now, Rhode Island has passed legislation that will be effective in 2014. That they're going to have photo ID. So they were the first of the New England states, and they did it last year.
Well, if we try to do that and implement it at the coming election, with all the redistricting and everything that's come about, that might even be more complicated then. People will come in, oh, I didn't know we had to have a photo ID, you know, don't read the newspapers or whatever, and I'm in the wrong district now. You know, is that going to make it more complicated?
Well, only in the cities. In the towns, they still vote in the same place, but in the cities, but you're talking, I'm not sure, I know you were involved in the national redistricting, so you would know better than me how many voters, but I know in Manchester, because I was on that commission that to redivide the wards, and what we did was we tried to keep the wards as close as possible to the way they were, so we didn't make any wholesale changes. If a ward was 300 down, we sort of, and we didn't displace anyone that was an incumbent. But there'll be over 1,000 in Manchester, and there'll probably be.
Yeah, we changed little things, like you said, little chunks, like the wards.
So you did the same.
Yeah, same basic thing.
But they did a real good job of making them fairly even, and that's why we didn't have as many problems as.
Yeah, the national one is very strange because if you, in which you're arguing, which is the main question I want to ask you on redistricting, how many times have they done a redistricting plan that didn't go to the courts?
Well, in 1980, we opened the filing period for the state senate without districts. We didn't have districts. And we had a courier come later from the Supreme Court saying, these are the districts. So it happened in 1980, and it happened 10 years ago. In 2002, we had 3 filing periods. We had a filing period in June for the federal and counties. And then we had a filing period in July, and then we had a filing period in August. The House had its own filing period, the Senate had its own filing period, because it's
going to happen again.
Well, it's unfortunate. I mean, it's unfortunate. The court should not be the ones making.
You can't, I mean, as you said, being involved was my first shot at it, which I don't know why I volunteered for. Like they say, you should never volunteer for anything, but people don't get that the whole plan, it'll just be all gone. And they're fighting over, you know, little sections of things that are going to affect the entire state, and at every level.
In 2002, it got so bad that when the Supreme Court issued its order for the Senate districts, it based the districts on the old Nashua ward lines that didn't exist anymore. So the House districts were based on the new ward lines, and the Senate districts were based on the old ward lines. So what it meant was that several wards in Nashua, the voters were going to have to go to 2 different polling places on the same election day to vote, because they had to vote in the Senate in one polling place and for the House in a different polling place. And when that order came out, when it was delivered to my office and I looked at it, it was a pretty interesting story about it. I mean, I just said, well, this can't stand. We can't have an election like this. And the House districts were bad enough because the court hired a person from South Carolina who had no understanding of New England and New Hampshire in particular form of government, where we have townships. The counties don't rule, it's the towns and the city. And so a plan for the House ended up being something that New Hampshire had never had ever before. And it was because a person who was hired to do it had no understanding of the history of New Hampshire and the history of the towns had rights in our state constitution. The legislature had very minimal responsibility for redistricting because the towns were given rights in the Constitution. If they had a certain number of individuals, they would have a representative. But that all changed because of federal court decisions starting in the 1960s. And so in 1980, we didn't have a very pleasant experience with it. And 2002, we did not have a very pleasant experience with it. It was awful. It was awful what resulted, and it was.
We should try to get it in,
right.
And hopefully Governor won't veto it because it'll be a worse mess than we can imagine.
Well, in Nashua, I've tried to say this shouldn't be a partisan issue because it's really you take your city and your town and that's how you should do it. But it's definitely become partisan Nashua. That all 5 Democrats are against it, 6, and 3 of them would be affected directly if the original plan, which would put Ward 3 into Hudson, and doesn't matter. So if you have that kind of obstinance, there's no way we're going to come to an agreement.
Well, the court ended up in 2002 reversing itself because of Nashua. I mean, when they realized that they were going to force people, the court actually asked for somebody to appeal their decision. And so their decision got appealed, and then they rewrote it.
Better write the appeal.
It's not.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I'd like to hear some of the statistics that you found from the result of the primary that we held in January.
Well, the primary was a pretty typical. It was different than 2008 because 2008 we had both parties with major contests. Right. This time we had one party, but our turnout this time was 311,000. Most of it was 4-1 roughly, the number that voted in the Republican primary versus the Democratic primary, which is understandable. Our absentee voting was about 4%, which is unheard of across the country. People can't believe that, and it was the same thing in 2008. We had 529,000 votes in 2008. Over 500,000 were cast on that day at the polling place, because people wait to the end. People want to make the right decision. People know that this is really important, and they care about it, as we know, because they have all the events leading up to it. And so people want to wait. And we have a lot of states now that have no-fault absentee. They get 20, 30, 40% of the ballots cast before the election. Election day isn't as meaningful as it is, but here, we don't have that. You can only vote by absentee if you have a reason, and yet we lead the country. In 2008, there was not the second highest state for turnout was over 10 percentage points below us. And you remember how long that cycle went. On the Democratic side, it went into May, and the Republicans, about half the states voted before the candidates changed. And this time it'll be the same for us. We always and there's always a question about the undeclareds. Should undeclareds be able to come in and vote? Our first state primary was September 5th of 1910, and we've had it every 2 years since then. And our first presidential primary was in March of 1916. Every primary, whether state primary or presidential primary, an undeclared voter can walk into a polling place and declare a party affiliation. And our law says when you declare, it says that you intend to support those candidates of that party in the election. Now, it's not an oath that people have to take, but that's in the law. So people have always been able to declare. What has changed over the years is how long they have to stay in the party. And it used to be that once you're in a party, you could never get out of a party. You could switch from one to the other, but once you declared, you were always declared. And that changed in the late 60s. And then there was only a 10-day period every 2 years that you could change your party affiliation. It was between 90 and 100 days before the September primary. And then that changed in the late 70s to say that the only time you couldn't change was between the first day of the filing period in June and the September primary. You couldn't change. So one party couldn't wait to see if another party didn't have contests, or they had contests but their party didn't, and then they could all change to cause a little disruption to the other party. So that's the way it has been. And then in the roughly late 80s, early 90s, it changed so that people on their way out could fill out a form. And the question is, are these undeclareds that participate, are they people that have no allegiance at all? And what's interesting, from the polls that Andy Smith has done at UNH, he has found when they've segregated out people who are not listed on the checklist, that there's pretty strong party affiliation, that a lot of those undeclareds are pretty strong party individuals. But for one reason or another, they don't want the party on the public checklist, because in the towns, those checklists have to be at either the general store or town hall, common place, and they get posted several times because we have more elections than any other state all year long. And some people would rather that remain to themselves. So when they were given the opportunity not to have it, they took advantage of it. And that's when the undeclareds went up. But the question is, are those undeclareds they're called independents, but from what every poll that has been done, they're not really independent. The true independents are
very few,
right? And they don't participate in primaries. But and there's a difference of opinion about that. But if you look in the primary, the number of undeclareds, the
largest party or group.
And what did you find in the result of this one? We're going to have to wrap this one up.
The registration, the undeclareds is now 38.4% of the voters. And the Republicans are now 32.8%, and the Democrats are 28.6%. The The Republicans now have 33,000 more registered voters than the Democrats. It was 8,000 before the primary. But when you take the primary, the presidential primary, there were 24,000 new registrants that registered that day, and there were 22,000 undeclared that took a party ballot but said they wanted to stay in the party. So when you take the combination, that gave the Republicans a 24,000
Very
increase.
interesting, very interesting. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank you again, Mr. Secretary. It was very interesting, and one of these days I think we're going to have a whole couple hours to talk
Yeah,
with
no,
you.
we definitely do this again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I actually...
I like being, made to feel dumb.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, yeah, good to be with you.